John lived alone for 10 long years on his quiet ranch, a wide stretch of land surrounded by golden grass and wind that never stopped blowing. Every morning he woke up before sunrise, fed the horses, and watched the light spill over the hills. The ranch had once been full of laughter, warm smells of cooking, and soft voices in the kitchen. But since Mary passed away, all of that was gone. The rooms felt too large now. Even the ticking of the clock sounded lonely. He had buried his wife near the old willow tree behind the barn. It was her favorite spot, where they used to drink coffee on early mornings. After the funeral, John stopped talking much. People from the nearby town came for a few weeks, bringing food and words of comfort, but soon they stopped coming. He told them he was fine, that he didn't need company, and after a while they believed him. His days all looked the same. He would work until sunset, eat a simple meal, and sit by the fire staring at the empty chair across from him. At night the wind pressed against the windows, and sometimes he thought he heard her voice calling his name. But it was only the wind, always the wind. Mary's younger sister Claire lived 2 towns away. She was different from Mary, lighter in spirit, always smiling, always talking. In the early years after Mary's passing, she used to visit the ranch once or twice a year, bringing pies or homemade jam. She would try to make him talk, try to get him to laugh, but John kept his heart closed. He didn't want to forget, and he didn't want to start over. So after each visit, Claire went back home quietly, feeling sorry for him but unable to help. Time passed. 10 years left their marks on both of them. Claire's life had not been kind either. Her marriage had ended. Her husband left without much explanation. She had spent her savings trying to start again, but life seemed to keep pulling her backward. She worked at a small store, lived in a rented house, and did her best to keep going. But one evening, a heavy storm rolled through the valley, tearing the roof off her home and flooding everything inside. With nowhere else to go, Claire sat in her car outside what was left of her house, crying softly as rain dripped through the windshield. Then she thought of John, quiet, steady John, who had always been kind even when he barely spoke. She hesitated for a long time before calling him. When he answered, she could barely get the words out. She said her home was gone, that she didn't have anyone else nearby. Could she stay at the ranch for a few weeks just until she found a new place? John was silent for several seconds. He looked around his house amid the clean but empty kitchen, the silent rooms, the echo of his own breathing. Finally, he said yes. His voice sounded tired but honest. He told her she could have the guest room and that he would meet her by the gate. When Claire arrived 2 days later, the evening sky was painted orange and pink. John stood near the fence, hands in his pockets, looking exactly the same as she remembered. Tall, quiet, his face lined from years of sun and wind. She smiled when she saw him, but he didn't smile back. He only nodded, took her suitcase, and carried it inside. The first few nights were uneasy. Claire tried to be careful not to disturb his routines. She cooked dinner, swept the floors, and tried to bring warmth back into the old house. She put fresh flowers on the table, opened the windows, and washed the curtains that hadn't been touched in years. John watched her quietly, unsure what to say. Sometimes she would talk while they ate, sharing small stories about town, about people he used to know. He would listen, but rarely answered. Still, something about her voice made the house feel less heavy. After a week, Claire started to see small changes in him. He began joining her at the table instead of eating alone in the kitchen. He helped with small chores she couldn't manage, like fixing a loose window latch or tightening the hinges on the old barn door. When she thanked him, he just nodded again, but this time there was a faint softness in his eyes. At night, she sometimes sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sky fade into deep blue. John would be out by the barn, checking the animals or mending tools. The soft light from his lantern would glow through the dark like a steady heartbeat. She admired how he carried his sadness, not by running from it, but by living with it every single day. One evening, after a long day of work, Claire found him sitting by the corral, staring at the horizon. The sky was streaked with pale clouds and the air was still. He looked older in that light, as if the years had been heavier than his body could carry. She walked toward him quietly. "You've been out here since sundown," she said softly. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Sometimes I sit here and try to remember her laugh," he said. "But it's been so long I'm afraid I've forgotten the sound." Claire felt a lump in her throat. She sat down beside him on the wooden rail, her hands folded in her lap. "You haven't forgotten," she said gently. It's still there, just buried under all those quiet years. They sat there for a long time without talking. The stars began to appear one by one. The sound of horses shifting in the distance filled the silence. Then, almost without thinking, Claire reached out and touched his hand. Her fingers brushed against his rough skin, warm from the evening air. John looked down at their hands but didn't move away. He simply stared for a long time, his eyes distant, his breathing slow. When she spoke again, her voice trembled slightly. "She loved this place," she said. "She used to tell me how happy you made her. I think she would have wanted you to be happy too." John's throat tightened. He wanted to speak but couldn't. For years he had buried his pain under work and silence, but now it was surfacing, not in tears but in quiet acceptance. He nodded, his hand still in hers, and whispered, "I don't know how to start again." Claire smiled sadly. "Maybe you don't have to start again," she said. "Maybe you just need to keep living." The wind stirred the grass, carrying their words away into the open night. Claire didn't say anything more. She just stayed there beside him, holding his hand until the lantern burned low. Later, as she walked back to the house, she glanced over her shoulder. John was still sitting there, staring at the stars. For the first time, he didn't look completely alone. That night, Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the guest room. The house was quiet except for the faint creak of the old walls. She thought of Mary, of the sister she had loved so much and the man who had loved her even more. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew something inside that house had begun to change. In the morning, when she came downstairs, John was already up. He had made coffee and set out 2 cups. He didn't say much, just nodded toward the table as she sat down. For the first time in 10 years, there was a small sound of life in the old ranch house. The quiet clink of cups, the faint echo of shared silence that didn't feel empty anymore. Outside, the horses moved slowly in the corral and the sky turned golden again. Somewhere in the still air, it felt like something lost had just begun to return. The days that followed carried a quiet rhythm, gentle and steady like the wind that moved through the dry fields. John began to speak more often now. Though his voice still carried that quiet weight, he would tell small stories about the ranch, about the time a calf got stuck in the fence or how Mary once painted the barn door bright red just to see if he'd notice. Claire listened with care, smiling at each memory, never pushing him to say more than he wanted. She could see he was trying to step out of the shadows he had built around himself. He started shaving again, wearing clean shirts, even brushing his hair before breakfast. When she noticed, she said nothing. But inside she felt a gentle warmth knowing she had helped him find small pieces of life again. One evening, as the sun went down and the sky turned a deep orange, Claire cooked dinner. Simple food, nothing fancy, but it filled the house with warmth. The smell of bread baking reminded John of long ago evenings, and for the first time in many years, he found himself humming softly as he set the table. Claire noticed and smiled. After dinner, they sat outside. The stars were coming out bright and endless. Claire wrapped a shawl around her shoulders while John leaned against the porch rail, looking at the horizon. There was peace between them, not heavy or confusing, just quiet understanding. He turned to her and said softly, "You made this place feel like home again." She looked at him, surprised by his words, and said gently, "It was always home, John. It just needed someone to open the windows." He smiled faintly, a rare thing for him, and nodded. Then silence settled between them again, but it was no longer empty. It was a calm silence that carried comfort. A few nights later, the wind picked up, strong and restless. The shutters shook and the old house groaned as if it remembered the years behind it. Claire couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, listening to the storm outside. Finally, she got up and went to the living room. John was there, sitting near the fire with a letter in his hand. It was one of Mary's old letters, the paper soft and yellowed with time. He didn't hide it when Claire came in. He simply looked up, eyes tired and filled with something deep. Not pain exactly, but the kind of sadness that had no words left. "She wrote this a few months before she got sick," he said quietly. "She said she wanted me to promise I'd never stop living. I didn't keep that promise." Claire came closer, her steps light on the wooden floor. She sat beside him, the firelight painting soft shadows across their faces. "Maybe you didn't stop living," she said. "Maybe you were just waiting for the world to catch up again." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes searching hers. "Do you really believe that?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I do, and I think she would too." For a while, neither spoke. The wind howled outside, and the fire flickered softly between them. Then John set the letter down and leaned back, his shoulders sinking with the weight of years. "I've spent so long trying not to feel anything," he said. Because feeling meant remembering, and remembering hurt. Claire's voice was quiet. "Sometimes remembering is what keeps people close. You don't have to stop missing her. You just have to let yourself breathe again." He looked at her, eyes glassy in the firelight. "You sound like her," he said. "She used to talk that way, gentle but certain." Claire smiled faintly. "Maybe it runs in the family." For the first time in years, John let himself laugh, a small, rough sound that surprised them both. It was short, but it was real. Claire couldn't help but smile. For a moment, it felt like the years of silence between them had finally broken. The fire burned lower. Claire rose to add another log, but John stopped her gently. "Leave it," he said. "It's warm enough." His hand brushed hers for only a moment, but it was enough to fill the space with quiet meaning. Neither of them spoke about it, but they both felt something shift. Not wrong, not hurried, just human. The storm passed before dawn. When morning came, the ranch was calm again. Dew sparkled on the grass, and the horses moved slowly near the fence. Claire stepped outside, breathing in the cool air. The sky was pale blue, and the world smelled clean again. She heard footsteps behind her. John came out holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her without a word, and they stood side by side watching the sun rise. The light touched their faces, and for a moment it felt like everything broken inside them had started to heal. Days turned into weeks. Claire found herself staying longer than she had planned. She started helping John with small things, feeding the horses, repairing fences, and keeping track of supplies. They worked side by side, talking about little things, laughing sometimes at small mistakes. The ranch, once silent and cold, was alive again with the sound of footsteps, voices, and the clatter of dishes after supper. The neighbors began to notice. Some whispered that John had changed, that maybe the quiet man wasn't so lonely anymore. Others stopped by to visit again, bringing pies or tools to borrow. The ranch that had once been forgotten slowly became part of the town's life again. One afternoon, Claire sat on the porch sewing when John came out with an old photograph. It was of Mary, standing in front of the barn with her arms around both of them, back when they were young and full of laughter. John handed the photo to Claire and said softly, "She'd be happy to see us sitting here." Claire held the picture for a while, her eyes misty. "I think she would," she said. "She loved you, John, and she would never have wanted you to stay alone forever." He nodded slowly. "I've thought about that every night," he said. "And maybe it's time I stop feeling guilty for being alive." Claire looked up at him. "That's all she ever wanted," she said. They didn't talk much after that. Words weren't needed anymore. There was understanding between them, deep, quiet, and steady. By the end of summer, the ranch was full of life again. Flowers bloomed near the porch, the fences were mended, and the old house smelled like baking and fresh air. John had aged, but there was color in his face again. He laughed more often now, not loudly, but enough to make the house feel safe and warm. Claire stayed. No one ever asked her when she would leave, and she never brought it up. Her presence filled the home naturally, like sunlight through the windows. Some of the neighbors whispered, wondering what truly went on between them, but John didn't mind. He had stopped living for other people's opinions a long time ago. On quiet evenings, they would sit together on the porch. Sometimes he would read out loud from one of Mary's old books, and Claire would listen, smiling softly. The world outside felt vast, but on that porch, everything seemed simple. 2 people who had both lost something, finding peace in each other's company. As the season turned, John stood by the willow tree one morning, the place where he had laid Mary to rest. Claire stood beside him, her hand light on his arm. The sun rose slowly, painting the fields gold. He looked down at the grave and whispered a few words too soft to hear. When he turned back toward the house, his steps were lighter than before. He didn't feel the sharp ache of grief anymore, and only gratitude. Life hadn't given him what he expected, but it had given him another chance at warmth, at companionship, at living again. That evening, as they watched the sunset together, Claire rested her head lightly against his shoulder. John didn't move away. He just sat still, watching the sky fade from gold to pink, feeling the quiet comfort of her beside him. For the first time in 10 years, the house no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like home again, not the same home it once was, but a new one built on understanding, kindness, and a promise silently shared between two hearts that had both learned to heal. And when the wind moved through the grass, it didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded like peace.